Tonight is very, very special for us. Jenn Freeman is a dancer, choreographer and dance educator based in New York City. No slouch either is Alex Hammer, his most recent project, and if you haven't seen this, I highly, highly, highly recommend watching it, is the 3-part documentary called Expecting Amy, which is on HBO. This documents the life of Amy Schumer and her husband Chris Fisher, which will become a very interesting loop in this discussion. It takes the viewer into the behind-the-scenes world of Amy Schumer as she very courageously battled through a very difficult pregnancy and also tenaciously worked to develop her 2019 stand-up special. So, as I say, if you have not seen those two, please do go home and during the snowstorm, I grant you these skills to entertain you, as long as our electricity doesn't get cut off. To dive in, I'd like to start by asking you, Jen, about the evolution of this project and the sense of urgency that you feel about it.
Okay, just making sure this is on. Hi everyone, thank you for coming, thank you. So I was hearing you earlier mentioning that this began as a different solo piece prior to receiving my diagnosis, and after that happened, my whole world just flipped, and what was important to me before, I had new questions, so wanted to dive into some new material, and I should tell about the whole story about everything. Okay, yeah. Sorry, I get nervous speaking. So the way that this came to be is during the first quarantine of COVID, I happened to watch Alex's film, Expecting Amy. Alex and I first met each other about 6 years ago now, working on a music video together. I was choreographing and dancing in the video, and Alex was directing. And since then, we've just sort of stayed admirers of each other's work and followed each other on social media. We didn't have a real friendship. We weren't in contact or anything. That was the extent of it. So I've just always kind of followed his work. I watch everything that he makes. So I watched Expecting Amy. I had no idea what it was about. Like Sara was saying, following Amy's pregnancy, creation of a comedy special, but there was a sidebar in the film about Amy's husband, Chris, and in the film he ends up receiving a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder, and it was when I was watching this episode that I had the epiphany that I too was autistic. I had never thought this about myself before. I was extremely uneducated about autism. It's just something about the way that he was speaking, about his relationships with his family and the way that they were speaking about him, it just clicked. So I ended up just calling Dr. Gilbert from the documentary, from Expecting Amy, Dr. Gilbert, you saw her in this trailer, but she is Chris's doctor, and I sort of started there and went on the process of getting a diagnosis, but this all came, during this journey I had wanted to reach out to Alex and just tell him thank you for making this film and thank you for leaving this as part of the story, because had you not, my life would be different. And I just wanted to wait until I got my official diagnosis because I wasn't sure what was going to happen. And on the morning of my diagnosis appointment, 30 minutes before my appointment, Alex messaged me. I hadn't spoken to him in 6 years. He has no idea that I saw the film, nothing. He messaged me and said, I just finished this project, Expecting Amy, and I'm working on a new idea for a documentary about people who use movement as therapy. And it, another sky-opening moment. Very serendipitous because, obvious reasons. I'm just learning that I've been therapizing myself with movement my whole life. So I got my diagnosis that morning, and he was the first person I called, even though I hadn't spoken to him in 6 years. I don't even really know you at this point that well. But I was like, you're not gonna believe this. And we started filming.
I was like, can you start filming right now, please?
He was like, I know this is really weird, but can you start filming today? And my worst nightmare is being the subject of a documentary. I hate being on camera. I hate speaking. But I don't know, when the universe aligns in that way, you kind of just say yes. And I had an extreme sense of urgency to share all of this new information, because the way that I found out about myself was because someone else had the courage to share their story. So I was being given this really beautiful opportunity to do that. And that's the story. Yeah.
Alex, perhaps you can speak a little bit about your side of the project?
Yes. I had just finished Expecting Amy, and my best friend actually was a dancer, a little older than me, and is now a therapist and got his degree and everything. He was working at the Harvey Milk School, which is a school for LGBTQ youth in the city. And he was working individually and in groups, and finding out that he was having a tough time breaking through, having kids open up. With a little bit of knowledge of what he had about Gestalt dance therapy, he applied a very easy, simple version to some of his individual sessions and group sessions, and to great effect. Like it opened up their minds and their attention to one another, and wanting to kind of share themselves through movement, as well as that just inspired everything else. So that was what the impetus of the idea. And then of course knowing Jen, I reached out to her, not knowing what this project would be, just like there's something here, I don't know what it is. And then all of this kind of fell into place. And it's been growing and compounding more and more since, because originally there wasn't a show necessarily. We weren't putting it together, we just knew that there was something we needed to discuss. And that's how we entered it. And then it built from there. And then Jen, still figuring things out, started to translate it to movement and working on it in that way, which is basically what we were talking about, is movement as therapy, and being able to express herself. So there's just so many different levels of story within just this one person and the circle that she surrounds herself with. And she sucked me in. So I'm now part of the circle. And it's been moving in a really exciting way, and a lovely way, I would say. It's been a really big pleasure to work on it, or work together. So, yeah.
So I think one of the things that comes away both from the film and then also, Jen, from how you have talked and some of the movement you showed us is this idea of movement as therapy. But I think that for you that's a much more nuanced conversation, and perhaps you'd like to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you for that. Since getting my diagnosis, I mean, it's been endless epiphanies, memories pouring in, because I'm able to start looking back and making sense of things that I've been confused about in my life. But the one thing that has been unwavering and a constant for me has always been dance. But I never really understood why. And now I just have much more clarity. I think, we've been talking about the difference between dancing and being a dancer, and I think those are two very different things. And I started dancing when I was 2.5 years old, and kind of just never stopped. It became an obsession of mine. And all growing up, you don't have to carry the weight of navigating a career or making money or, networking and all of those things. I was just dancing for dance's sake. And that was therapeutic for me in many ways. One of the main traits of autism is, struggles with social communication, relating to others. And in dance class, I was fully having a social experience. I was with other people. I was in communication with my teacher. They were seeing me, I was seeing them. We were communicating through movement, but I never had to open my mouth, ever, really. So that was a very, very comfortable experience for me. And, a lot of the traits of my autism were rewarded in the dance environment. My love of repetition and really diving into things. I wasn't necessarily physically gifted child. I just kind of practiced more than everyone because I was obsessed, and my teachers liked that. And Yeah, as far as like regulating my emotions, you know, spinning like you saw was something, walking up on your toes, all of these things that I was kind of doing were welcome in that environment. And when I became the age, you know, where a lot of children begin to experience bullying or they become othered, I was so inside my dancing and everyone around me knew it, that, you know, if I was moving around or spinning at school or doing these things, people just said I was dancing. So that language really protected me in a big way. But yeah, we've been having this conversation about, you know, it's easy to fall into the narrative of dance saved me, and I don't like to think that because I don't think that autistic people need to be saved. But it was definitely an outlet for me and a special interest that my family supported and everyone around me supported, and that really helped me through life and still is supporting me in a really big way. Yeah.
And I think there's something really interesting, you know, you've talked about, and also in the film, about the diversity of manifestations of autism, hence also the diversity of ways of coming to terms with autism and living in a neurotypical world as somebody who's non-neurotypical.
Yes, yes. I think, I mean, I know for me, my experience of getting this diagnosis at the age that I did, I'm really discovering that, you know, there's no problem with being autistic. For me, it was that I didn't know about it. And I think, you know, I have a dear friend of mine who's questioning a possible diagnosis for her child, and I was just reminding her the other day, you know, there's nothing wrong with him. He's incredible. The struggles that you're seeing are because he's being expected to function in a world full of people whose brains are different than him, you know. But if if it was a world full of him, he would be fine. This is not a story about struggle. I really want to drive that home as well. I mean, there are struggles, but this truly has been such a gift. It's just an opportunity to know myself, because I haven't felt that I've been able to do that up until this point. So.
Alex, can you perhaps speak about the fact that you have now worked with two individuals who are on the autism spectrum, and what that is like to direct them in a creative project?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is interesting because this project is both stage and doc, which are two very different things. They both work together, but being a creative voice for her performance and what the show's going to become, hopefully, versus being kind of objectively viewing and trying to be objective, excuse me, but I have inserted myself into her life to the point where I've noticed a lot of things. And working with Chris prior to this, I was much more removed from that process, and I didn't see myself too much in Chris's story. But when I started working with Jen, I still had all these preconceived notions of what it meant to be on the spectrum, because it really is a range and everybody's individual. But with Jen traveling and just basically being together 24/7 in a multitude of environments, from teaching huge amounts of students to being the aftermath of what that looks like, I started seeing parallels with myself and how I function and how I work. Not to mention all the stories that Jen has shared with me and I've now shared with her, and the links in between. So I actually started the process recently and was diagnosed as well. So, but just saying that this project, even in its infancy, and just as a trailer we just put together to hopefully start reaching out to people, has already affected not only me, but your friend, and it's been rippling in these much smaller circles already. And so to have it with a slightly wider audience or a wider view, both the performance itself and the doc, we just feel, or we know that it's going to reach people that need to see it, that may not even know that they will benefit from it.
Thank you for sharing that, Alex. That was very
Yeah, you're the first group of people I told.
You're the first
So very new.
It's very, very new. So.
Can you both speak about something which I think is very interesting, which is you're both very successful in your chosen areas of expertise and in your careers. and yet here you are learning this life-altering fact about yourself. How is that to live through, and how is that also to work through?
Well, do you want me to go first?
Sure.
I think, and I'm not speaking for you, but a similar, okay, I'm going to speak for her. Some of our similarities happen to do with our determination in our art form. And like she said, when she was growing up, she was fully invested in the art of dance and performing. And it was as an adult that you had to start shifting into how to network that, how to live off of that, how to reach an audience, or how to mingle with other performers. So the logistics of it are things that we both have struggled with a lot. And so with me, I'm always someone who's like, let the work speak for itself, because I don't want to have to explain it. It is something that we both would put, what's the term, you put your nose to the grindstone? That's not it.
Yes.
The nose to the grindstone?
Nose to the grindstone.
Nose to the grindstone. And that's our North Star, is basically like, we're working on what we're working on, and it's going to be the best we can make it to the best of our ability, regardless of outlet, regardless of audience, regardless of, you know, trying to get it out there. And so this is a big step, just sitting in front of you guys. Thank you, by the way, for showing up. We didn't actually expect an audience. We thought we were going to be here, you know, just practicing. So,
For me, and we relate on this as well, I was sort of reaching a point in my life for the first time where this path that I have been on started to feel a bit impossible, because the way that I was working was no longer sustainable. Because I've been ignoring myself and just pushing through, because I really did have this feeling that it was kind of life or death for me. If I didn't have dance, I really didn't know how to function in the world. So I was going to do whatever it takes to be successful as a dancer, because there's nothing else for me. And I started to, you know, experience signs of burnout for the first time in my life. And it's kind of around when this diagnosis showed up. So I think I have a really invested interest in, for the first time ever with this show, like, what does a process look like that is not triggering to me, that I can actually get through in a healthy way? And I have a lot of curiosities about that, because I've never experienced that before. And I don't know, this feels like a test in a way, because if I can somehow figure out how to do it, it gives me hope that I can keep doing it.
We're going to open it up to questions, but I just want to ask one more question of both of you, which is about what do you want the public to take away from these two projects for you, Jen, and the documentary for you, Alex?
For me, I know that I'm not alone, and I know that there are others out there, and you know, if they can see any bit of themselves in this story, I think that's a huge step forward. And I think this piece and this documentary are really they're for everyone. They're not just for autistic people. They're for people who love autistic people, people who know autistic people. I know for me personally, receiving this diagnosis has just sort of like blossomed this new level of empathy inside myself, because before I was almost double downing on myself, and therefore I was having a hard time keeping space, holding space for others. And now that I can really see myself and understand what's happening, I feel like I'm able to see people and hold space for people. And you know, that's what I hope this piece does. Yeah.
I think for me, to just piggyback off of exactly what you're saying, it's kind of the reason why I think the doc is important is because it being simply able to be seen in a multitude of environments by people who may not be able to make it to the show, or physically, depending on where they fall on the spectrum, who may want to see it but can't be in an environment like that, makes it accessible. And I do think that the work that I do tends to be very character-based. It's following Jenn's very specific story with her partner, who's over there. You saw him in his underwear earlier, that's him. It, I think, grounds it in reality and joy, and I think that translates to screen. So it's meant to be a celebration of figuring things out.
Yeah.
I have one more question I would like to ask. Sorry, I'll get to you. Sorry, you didn't get your hand up fast enough. One of the other things that for me is really interesting in your work and also as a part of your diagnosis is this idea of self-care and self-empathy.
Yeah.
And I think that with the situation we are in with the pandemic, that is such an important message. And for your project in the documentary, I think that's something that's really important to highlight.
Yeah, I think, I had no idea how to properly care for myself. I was not doing a great job before knowing this information.
Lots of compensating.
Yeah, lots of compensating and trying to make other people around me feel comfortable. I don't know if this makes sense, but I never really understood that just because I was having a feeling, that feeling was valid. I think being an autistic person, you're taught sometime when you're young that the way you are is not okay, so you learn to look elsewhere for cues, and then that becomes just the way you live your whole life. So you become secondary in a way. So, having a thought, questioning it, discounting it, checking if it's right, I was doing a lot of that, which is exhausting. And so now I'm in the practice of just trusting my thoughts, my feelings, being where I am. I'm still kind of in this burnout phase. I know a lot of people are experiencing that right now, and so I'm trying to I'm trying not to prove myself anymore. I'm trying to just be where I am, and it's not pretty all the time, and I'm trying to sit in that.
Nope.
It's not. He knows.
I think for me, to again piggyback off of what you said, you are basically doing an impersonation of people that are around you, and if you're taught well or in a positive way, you learn social graces, you learn how to communicate, you learn all of these things that help you along, but a lot of your thoughts and actions are so different from the people around you that you tend to overachieve and overcompensate because you think everybody else thinks and feels this way, but they're doing it. So not knowing, you basically are running at 110% your brain all the time in order to kind of function in both. And taking away or learning about this is to basically almost just, in the simplest of terms, be kinder to yourself in the sense that it's okay that you feel a certain way, can't do something, have no energy, need to shut down, and because you are constantly, it's processing everything around you at all times. Yeah.
Yeah.
I have two diametrically opposed questions. One goes to, I teach a lot of students who are having a lot of trouble with self-care and trying to create an environment.
Yeah.
But so where does, one sort of question goes, how do we make a world in which self-care is important? But then on the opposite side, my question to you is, would we lose so many gifts? So many that in that passion, in that doubling, having a world where we all are accepted and somehow normal, which is what I think we're reaching for. On the other hand, will we lose the incredible beauty of your movement, which is so unique, so exciting, so, I don't know. I understand now it comes from both pain and joy. At what cost to you?
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Is there like a normative where we all fit, but on the other hand, what gifts do we lose?
I think that's such a beautiful question. Is it okay to respond?
Yeah, go for it.
I don't want a world where everyone's normal, for sure. But I think for me, I think dance and movement has always been inside me, and I think I would have desired doing it, and for much of my life it was a very healthy obsession and a very healthy way to express myself. I think, I think I would have been dancing anyways. And I think when I got to college and got to places where I was sort of more on my own, had I known about my brain, I would have known that I needed to ask for help. And I would have had support that I needed. And that's, to be placed on the autism spectrum, you require support. It's by definition. So I think it's not, erasing the beauty or, the neurodivergence in the world. I think people are going to do what they want to do, and luckily I had the support behind it. But I personally just needed a little bit more support, and I didn't have it, and that became the problem. And I think that's why diagnosis is so important, and I think people are afraid to, put that label on their children. They don't want their children to be othered, but a child who is autistic already knows that their brain is different innately. So you're kind of teaching them to not see themselves in this weird way by not acknowledging it, if that makes sense. And I think for me, to talk about your first question, in my own practice as a teacher, my whole mindset has shifted since receiving this information, because I used to run my classroom in a really rigid way. You need to stand still, eyes forward, all of these things, because that's what I was trying to do myself, and I thought that's what it took to be successful in this world, and that's like all gone for me now.
I think it's wonderful. Maybe that's also part of the message is, find your gift, use it.
Exactly. That's what you're just going to say. Yeah, exactly.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Is basically leaning into whatever that special interests or interests multiple are for these kids, because it's a creative or clever or comforting outlet. Hers just happened to be in an area where this is a profession, and so it was seen as something that could be progressing her life forward versus being something that may not, it's not appropriate or it's not helpful for what we believe your child should be, what path they should be on, whatever that should be. And for me, I was encouraged, I was art my whole life, all different kinds, fine arts to digital arts and film, that because I excelled in it and loved it, I was not always good, I just loved it so much that I worked at it. And it makes a lot of sense where I fall on the filmmaking arena or group is very much, makes sense to me now as to why I am in that position and why I am so hyper-focused on certain things. So I was also very fortunate to have a lot of support and a lot of love and a lot of encouragement. Yeah.
First of all, I just wanted to say this was just a really beautiful experience. Did you tell your parents? I mean, of course you told your parents.
Yes.
What was their reaction?
Stay tuned.
I did tell my parents because, a huge part of the struggle that I've experienced is that I've had a really hard time successfully communicating with my family. And I've kind of felt isolated in that way, and I never could make sense of it in my mind because there's so much love in my family. I have so much support. My parents have given up everything for me to pursue dance. It's just, they're incredible, but there was still, my mom and I just butting heads, and I've been to therapy and trying to make sense of it and had all this guilt of, just not understanding. And I think on my parents' side, same experience. Like, my parents still always describe, sort of the struggles when I was younger. They still bring it up all the time. I cried a lot. And I'm like, can we stop bringing this up? I'm 34 years old. I'm sorry I cried a lot when I was a baby, but it was clearly traumatizing for them. But I also grew up in Star, Idaho, in the middle of nowhere. My town had 700 people in it. And just the chances of me receiving a diagnosis young were, and also Asperger's, which we don't use that term anymore, but I would have been diagnosed with Asperger's. That wasn't even a diagnosis until the mid-90s. I would have already been 8 years old. So what are you gonna do, But, so it's really get this information, sharing it with my parents. I feel like we're finally able to see, it's like, okay, we don't need to hash it out. This is what was happening. And it's no one's fault, it's not their fault, it's not my fault. people reacted poorly in certain situations, but if you don't know, you don't know. Like, where do you begin, you know? So I did part of my experience anyways with Dr. Gilbert is through the diagnosis process, she asked if she could speak to my parents. And luckily both of my parents are around, and they were able to do that and give insight into the way, you know, their experience of me as a child, which was really, really helpful. But I would say that my experience with my parents, my relationship with them is honestly night and day from what it was, and it wasn't great before. So that feels really hopeful. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
You talked a little bit about your parents, and you mentioned Dr. Gilbert. I was struck by the way in which you expressed a number of times. I think you used the phrase something like, when I got my diagnosis, or when I received my diagnosis.
Yeah.
It sounds like an external visitation, like when I got hit by that truck.
Yeah.
You know, or when I was in that airplane crash.
Yes. Yeah.
You make it sound like it was an instantaneous epiphany.
It was. It was like, well, director Sonia Taya, she's directing the piece. She's one of my dearest best friends, but I've been describing this to her, and I think most people would think, you know, realizing something like this, that you are autistic, it's almost like the world would like cave in on you. I felt like everything opened. Like, everything opened. Like the world got like large. My head like opened up. And I still can't, I've seen Expecting Amy a million times. I don't specifically know like a moment. It was just sort of this collective, the way Chris was speaking, the way his family was speaking about him, I was like, I'm relating. And then I was like, this is me. And I was sitting between Ian and one of my best friends who was living with me at the time, and I was just kind of frozen. I didn't say anything, I didn't react at all. Finished watching the documentary, I went into my bedroom and I'm like Googling everything because I knew nothing. I had to Google Expecting Amy and like what the diagnosis was to remember what I didn't know anything about autism. And you know, it was like I was reading a book that someone had written about me personally, all these things that I've experienced that I've never stated out loud, that I have never even been able to verbalize or put words to myself. I'm reading it, and it's many, many, many things. And so I started keeping a list on my phone of the way that like my life related to what I was reading, and the list was just getting really, really, really long. And I ended up deciding...
You did all the legwork, basically.
Yeah, I did everything. He just follows me around. So.
That's true.
I got to the point where I actually started to, for the first time in my life, like that when people describe not being able to trust your thoughts, like I can't tell if this is real or not, or, you know, I started to feel that way. I started to feel crazy because I was like, I'm making this up. Am I making this up? But this is real, you know, and I ended up telling Ian, and he actually said the perfect thing. You know, I read him the list, and he was like, these are, you know, these things are real. You're not making this up. And he said, I've thought this before. And that moment was really, really powerful because, you know, I was like, thank God I'm not crazy. But on the other hand, I was like, oh wow, has everyone known this about me? And has everyone been thinking this? And I had no idea, you know? But anyways, yeah, so I ended up telling Sonia, I ended up telling my, you know, my other best friend Chelsea, and that was the point I decided to call Dr. Gilbert. But these were very long, drawn out conversations, lots of tears, lots of panic attacks. You know, at this point I'm able to say it was a gift and this is a good thing, but at the time it was like trudging through all of that was very difficult. Thank you. Yeah.
Yes.
First an observation, then a question. The observation, something you said, I was thinking about what new behaviors have you learned since you've been diagnosed that you could deal with this? And you said something that my uncle told me 35 years ago, and he said, how do you do that? And he said, Jack, you have to learn to be a friend to yourself. I said, how do you do that? He said, you'll find your way. It's taken me a long time, so it's not just, I'm not autistic, but you are, so it's probably more difficult.
Yeah.
But you're still, that's a goal to achieve.
That's really beautiful. I think it's really interesting, like what new behaviors. I don't have new behaviors. I'm just trying to let my behaviors exist. Like my real urge. Like that's the practice. I don't know if you experience this, but like the first couple of times after getting my diagnosis and seeing Dr. Gilbert, I was like, all right, we got the diagnosis. Like, what are we gonna do about this? Like, I'm ready to do all this work because I'm so used to working on myself all the time. And like, I remember sitting through my first few therapy sessions and I was like, what are we even doing? This is like, she's just kind. And this is about acceptance. And I was like, well, we're not doing anything. Like, you know, and then I learned that there's nothing to do. There's nothing to fix. And that's what's liberating, is that when you learn this about your brain is not going to change. This is the way you are. Your struggles are your struggles. You live with them and you become a friend.
Perhaps time for one more question? Yes?
Just a quick observation of how little we've been talking about dance.
Well, with that, I would just like to thank you so much for joining us tonight. Personally, after about a 20-year career in museums, I'd like to say this is one of the most important discussions I've ever had. And I would like to thank Jen and I would like to thank Alex so much for being here. So survive the snow, and thank you. And if this subject moves you, if this subject is important to you, you could consider supporting it. You can keep yourself abreast of both Jen's upcoming performance, which is developing out of this material, as well as the documentary. And thank you.